This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven. And today I'm joined by Josie because we thought as we were walking around the garden and making plans and plotting and planning and designing all our bulb combinations for next spring, her take on bulbs is sometimes, not always, but sometimes slightly different to mine. And she looks at it from a design point of view, of course, but also incredibly practical point of view. So what are the bulbs that you can plant in the autumn season that give you really, really high performance with somehow less maintenance and somehow easier to look after? So welcome, Josie. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And so I'm just going to interview you, really, if that's all right, and just get you to sort of justify why you've chosen what you've chosen. So I think you've chosen 14 or 15 bulbs that are your absolute must-haves. And I'm going to grill you as to why they're so good, and then we'll move on to the next one. So let's make a start. Shall we start with tulips, because they are everybody's favourite autumn planting, spring flowering bulb. So talk me through your 5 selections of tulips.
Okay, so I've chosen these really because, as you say, they're relatively trouble-free and they give you such a good show. I'll start off this is an early tulip, Orca, which is an orange. You know, it's a great introduction to tulip season with its big pow of orange. It's a double, so you don't need that many in a pot because it's got quite a big head on it. We often don't combine it with anything. It's all you need in a pot because it puts on such a show. It's not very tall. What is it, 25, 30 centimetres. So it's not knocked about by, we can often get really quite bad weather when this one's out. So it puts up with that really well. Looks great in a vase. If you have it as a single head in a small bud vase or something, you don't need many. It just looks spectacular. So that's my Orca, my first one off.
And it's got not a strong, but like lots of oranges, it's got a really nice, gentle fragrance, hasn't it? So that's a kind of added bonus.
And I'd recommend to anybody growing tulips, stick your nose in all of them because it's surprising. A lot of them do have scent. And of course, ones like Ballerina, it's such a classic, fabulous tulip and such a good scent. But not actually on my list. But, there's so many classics. There's so many that I could have chosen. It was really hard to pin it down.
Okay, so number 1, Orca. So what's your number 2?
So number 2 is Slower, which is that deep crimsony blackcurrant edged with apricot. It's such a beautiful tulip. And it just goes with everything. If you look through our catalogue or online, you can see it appear in so many of our collections. It just sits so nicely in the different colour palettes, and it's a fabulous thing. I wouldn't be without that. And it's a good returner as well. It's quite perennial, isn't it?
It is. And I'm just going to butt in there, even though I said I wasn't going to say much, which is whenever I'm struggling with a collection that it's missing something. And to put together collections, quite often I just pick one head of each variety that I really want to include. And then sometimes it just doesn't quite gel. It's missing something. And but normally Josie says, have you tried Slower? And then off we go to the Slower patch. And indeed, As soon as you put it in, it's like Solomon's seal, don't you think? I think Solomon's seal's like that. As soon as you put it in, any border...
Holds everything together, doesn't it?
Holds everything together. Exactly. Okay, so that's your number 2. What about number 3?
So number 3, I've gone for another orange. Bit obsessed with these oranges. Hermitage,
Lovely.
which it's a sport from Princess Irene. A lot of people know Princess Irene. It's a dusky orange with that blackcurrant staining underneath. So it sounds a bit like a fruit salad, all the things I'm describing. But, that is exactly what it's like. And again, we often have it in the Oast Garden or the Oast Garden pots. And it sits so nicely in there. It's a lovely, deep, dusky orange. So definitely I recommend that.
It's like Princess Irene, but with some sort of crimson added into it. So it's sort of, it's like a blood orange Princess Irene. That's how I always think of it.
Yes, yeah. Just a bit more subtle, I suppose, in a way. A bit more class, let's say.
Okay. Well, that's debatable. But yes, I think Princess Irene's pretty classy.
I know, she is. And this is a step up.
Yeah, good. And number 4?
So I'm going off the oranges now into a white and an early Kaufmanniana type, which is ice stick. It's got such an elegant shape, which is white, and it's got plum streaks on it. Again, if you want a really early, lovely tulip, definitely I would take that one on.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say if you want a tulip for the end of February or the beginning of March, there's nothing that will do it more reliably than ice stick. It is genuinely, Orca, as you say, I think of as early flowering, but ice stick is 3, even 4 weeks earlier than that. So it really is incredibly early. I agree. I love it. It's perfect in a succession because it comes so early.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
And your final tulip, Josie?
So I've gone white again, still with the blackcurrant. So silver cloud, a very elegant silvery white, and it's got a blackcurrant wash over it.
Yes, I would call it more mauve than white, but you're right. It's got a white base, definitely.
It's sort of a silvery mauvey white, isn't it? Hard to describe, but very beautiful. And again, it'll go with so many of the pale colours. It fits in with any of those. And, can even take it into the purple colours. Yeah, definitely. Very nice tulip.
So both Slough and Silver Cloud, you're saying, are the perfect mixes in a way.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. If you're struggling, if you want to put 3 tulips together, then those 2 are often the ones that'll join, different colour palettes and hold it all together.
Great. Fantastic. All right. So I love all of those. I'm not going to argue with any of them.
Not going to dispute any of those.
I'm not going to dispute any of those, no. So let's move on to, should we move on to Narcissus then? So talk me through your Narcissus. I think you've told me that you've selected 4, not 5 here, but that's perfect.
Yeah, this is a mistake on my part because I love Narcissi more than anything, really. And I've steered away from the yellows. I love the yellows like Coco Pelli and Tete-a-Tete. They're so sweet and delicate. But I've chosen sort of more unusual ones, just hoping that people will try something a little bit different. So top of my list is, well, in no particular order, I should say, is Princess Amalia.
Yes, yeah.
So this is a later Narcissus, flowering in April, 45 centimetres, and it's a creamy white. It's the most beautiful, delicate Narcissus. So yes, I do love that one.
I love that. And we've got it in 2 different places actually here in the garden at Perchhill. It's in the base of the fruit cage and it's been coming up for probably 5 years there. And like all Narcissus, very perennial, but again, really early. So I walk past that when I go and feed the hens and let the hens out in the morning. And it's one of the first that I can pick to put a jug of daffs, even though it's a very classy daff. So we tend to call them narcissi rather than daffs. But yeah, it's beautiful. It's got an ivory whirl of petals and then a sort of slightly deeper ivory trumpet. And we use it there, but also we have it in pots in a lasagne. Perhaps we could talk about lasagnes just briefly, Josie, while we're mentioning Princess Amalia, because you did the most beautiful lasagna of it in a big copper here outside my kitchen window. And you had Princess Amalia and Narcissus Herrera, I think it was, and then a Mascari in it as well. So will you just talk everyone through? I know lots of you will know how to do the lasagnas, but if Josie just quickly explains how we do them here, that would be good.
Yes, so if I describe a bigger pot, so this wouldn't apply to a small pot. So you've got, say, 3 layers in a big pot, and that's a 50 to 60 centimetre pot. So, crocks in the bottom of your pot, and then at least 10 centimetres of compost. So the bottom layer of bulbs have got something underneath them to root into. And we use just peat-free multi-purpose compost for planting our bulbs in. No specialist bulb compost for outdoor pots. That's just more for indoor pots. So 10 centimetres of compost, and then your layer of bulbs, not touching, just a bulb width in between each bulb, if that makes sense. And then say about another 8 centimetres of compost on top of them. Then your next layer of bulbs, then another 8 centimetres of compost. I mean, don't measure it, it's just an approximation. And then if you're going to add a final layer, like we add little iris reticulata or crocus on top, then they go on top with, just covering them with a layer of compost. So you've got 3 layers of bulbs and compost in between.
And so in the big container, Josie, with Princess Amalia, you would put the biggest bulb, which is Princess Amalia Narcissus, in the base.
Yes.
And then you would put the next Narcissus, which I think is Herrera, that you did in the next layer up. And then the final layer would be the smallest bulb, which would be the Mascari. I think you used Siberian Tiger or one of the pales.
I think it was, yes.
Yeah,
a nice white Mascari.
Great. Okay, so your second Narcissus.
So my second Narcissus is Lemon Drops. This is a multi-headed Narcissus, really sweet and elegant. I tend to put it more in on its own, not mix it with other things. You get a good show because it's multi-headed. You don't need quite so many in a pot, but it looks beautiful. A lovely little thing. And then I've gone for Elka, which is another ivory. Smaller than Princess Amalia, 30 centimetre high. It flowers in March, so it's sort of, early, really. And again, it's just such a beautiful Narcissus, and it'll come back. All these will come back year on year. That's why I really love Narcissi. They're so good for returning. Very perennial.
Yeah, even in pots. And isn't Elka, am I right in saying it's a brother of Tete-a-Tete? I have a feeling it's the same sort of genetic.
It's quite possible. It has that same, classic look to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Just the pale version.
Okay, great. And your final Narcissi?
So that's Carice, which is
lovely.
Yeah, it has that pink grapefruit trumpet to it with pale back petals. So that's really fabulous. And it's sat in our pot in that perennial cutting garden corner, hasn't it? It's been there for a few years now.
I know, isn't that amazing? You just don't do anything to it, do you? It just comes up in that same pot. I mean, that's just incredible.
Yeah, we might shuffle a bit of the top compost off and give it a bit of fresh compost on top each autumn and tuck it away over the summer because people don't necessarily want to look at a pot full of compost. And back it comes every year. So it's a really fabulous thing and a lovely colour combination in one flower as well.
Can I just butt in there, actually? Because one of the things that I've been working on recently is Tom Stimpson, who is our head of horticulture, and he's got a wonderful, wonderful garden, which I've done a podcast on, so many of you will have heard about him. But he has that technique exactly in his tiny, what we call pipe pot garden. He has narcissus and various other things in pots, which he just tucks around the back of a big pot, which has got a maple in it. So you just don't see them, really. They just sit sort of dormant but happy, growing through the summer. And then in early spring, he brings them out to prize a place again. And it works incredibly well. So those people with really small spaces, just bear that in mind, is just having these rotating pots that you can hide away. almost like under a climber, against the wall or against the fence or against, whatever. And then bring them out when they're looking great and let them do their sort of 10 weeks in the sunshine and then put them back in again. And Carice is exactly the same.
Yeah, and if they're tucked away, as you're saying, behind something, that'll keep the rain off them, because you don't want them being soaked all summer. So if they're tucked away under something, that's really ideal for them.
Good. Okay, so then you wanted to mention Iris reticulatus. So let's move on to them as your sort of whole of spring bulb selection inclusion.
Yes, so Iris reticulatus we love here for topping off our bigger pots. And I've gone for Catherine's Gold, which will sit really well, either with really early tulips. It fits in really nicely with narcissi if you want to combine it in a pot. Yeah, it's unusual, because we usually think of, my other Iris reticulata is Purple Hill, and we usually think of Iris retics like in that coloration. But Catherine's Gold is quite an unusual colouring. I'm not sure it'll be to everyone's taste, but I think it's really nice.
Yeah, it's strong and zappy for sure.
Yeah, and these iris come back year after year. And if you're emptying your pots, just save them. Perhaps we should just mention how what we do with our bulbs afterwards. So if you want to reuse your pots, then when all the foliage has died down, take your bulbs out, put them in a net, and store them somewhere cool and dry. And then come late August, September time, you can get back to planting them up again. So yeah, particularly these, not all tulips are repeat. They're marked perennials, the very reliable ones. But narcissi and Iris reticulatas are really, reliably perennial. So look after them.
Yeah, good. And then we're both crazy about another whole troop of irises. And I know you wanted to mention these because we find that gardeners just don't seem to know how great these are, which are the Dutch iris family. So Josie really wanted to put a strong case for the Dutch iris. So you go for it.
Yes, the Iris hollandica, the Dutch iris flower, when the tulips finish. So you've got this gap between, it's the May gap, really. Put Dutch iris in. They're such good plants, very perennial. They'll form bigger groups over the years. And the colours, some of the newly bred colours are just so lovely. You've got a whole colour range now, haven't you, really? There's everything
Absolutely
available. They're quite tall. What are they, 50, 60 centimetres? But we use them. So we've got in a lasagne in the border. So same principles as in a pot, but in the border we have the narcissi will come first, and then the Dutch iris will fill that gap when they finish, and then the dahlias after that, because we leave our dahlias in the ground. So, that's a nice, easy succession. But yeah, definitely worth looking at the Dutch iris.
And in a layer, aren't they? So the narcissus are the biggest, deepest down at sort of 8 to 10 inches, or certainly 8 inches on a bed of grit. And then you've got the Dutch iris, as you say, sort of 8 to 10 centimetres of topsoil mixed with grit backfilled over the narcissus, then Ingo the Dutch iris, and then 8 to 10 centimetres of grit and soil mix goes in over the top of them, and then Ingo the dahlias, which are just below the soil surface. So you need to lift your dahlias from somewhere else in the garden and pop them in over the top. And then you mulch your dahlias a good 6 inches, so 15 centimetres over the top in autumn. And that will then perennialise that whole combination, but including the dahlias, so they don't get frosted. So in the bottom is narcissus, in the middle is the Dutch iris, and in the top is a dahlia. And those give you anyway flowering pretty much all year. But if you add around the outside, in the base, hyacinths, alternating with alliums, they then add in more into your succession. So then you've got narcissus like Avalanche and Cragford, which are really early, moving on to hyacinths around the outside with things like Actaea narcissus, flowering in March. Then in April, you can go for a later narcissus like geranium, and you can have them flowering again, some of the later hyacinths, which are around the outside. Then in May, you can have the latest flowering Narcissus of all, which is recurvus. And then the Dutch iris starts. So in May, you've got Dutch iris. June, you've got Dutch iris. July, then your dahlias start. And particularly the single dahlias are the earliest to flower. So they'll flower June into July. So then dahlias, July, August, September, October, November, into December, with later flowering varieties again tend to be the singles. And then in January, again, in a mild season, you'll get Narcissus avalanche flowering. So with a lasagne in a border, you really have got stuff to look at and stuff to pick pretty much all year round.
Yeah. And I think you mentioning hyacinths, people sort of put off planting hyacinths in the garden. You know, they imagine them as the forced hyacinths at Christmas, which are lovely for the house. But if you plant them in the garden, they are perennial, and they lose that big headedness, don't they, after a couple of years, and they become very elegant plants and so worthwhile having.
Yeah, totally. And actually, in that rotation that I did off the top of my head, I forgot, of course, the alliums. So May, June and July. So if you put the alliums around the outside, you can have purple sensation for May. You can move on to something like Christophii for June, and then you can move on to something like Sphyracophyllon for July into August. So they would add into your selection. But we've got all this in the podcast notes, so don't be desperately scribbling down and rewinding this podcast, because you'll find all those details of both the bulb lasagne in a pot and the bulb lasagne in a border that Josie's mentioned will be in the podcast notes. So final one, Josie, what would be your final, which I think takes us to 15, but I haven't counted?
Okay, I'd put in Gladiolus byzantinus, that beautiful magenta spires. Again, that's May, June, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which fills the gap. And I just love its brilliant colour. I can't, what do they call it in the West Country? I think it's...
Whistling Jack.
Whistling Jack, that's it. But, here it doesn't spread hugely or anything. It's a very well-behaved plant, especially on our clay. That's something I wouldn't be without. And once the flowers fade, towards the middle of summer, it just has the most elegant seed heads. And we use those quite a lot in dried flower arrangements and things. But, they're really good in that. So, yeah, Gladiolus byzantinus I would have as my final choice.
And before we end, Josie, will you just talk everyone through the brilliant realization of the numbers that you need for different sizes of pots, and also how many you need for like a square meter? But it's just, I think people are really not clear, even if you're doing a lasagna, how many bulbs you want to have a really showy pot, and perhaps also in a single layer. So Josie's done a lot of trialing of this, so it'd be really good for you to tell everyone.
Okay. I mean, it's just a simple guide. It's not set in stone. Please don't think this is what you have to do. So if you had, say, a 30 centimetre pot, 30 centimetre diameter and height, which is quite a standard size pot, then you probably need 30 bulbs to put on a good show. This is just taking an average sized tulip bulb or narcissus. You get some really fat bulbs, so you'd have to reduce the numbers. But that can either be in 2 layers or a single layer. So if you've got a big whopper pot, a 60 centimetre diameter pot, then you need 60 bulbs. So just think, what diameter is it? I need that many bulbs. And again, you can put those in 2 layers. You couldn't get 60 in a single layer, so they would have to go into 2 or 3 layers, depending on the combinations you've got.
Does it then follow that in a metre of ground you do 100 bulbs, or is that too many?
Oh, now you put me on the spot.
I would guess it's 60 to 70, because in the ground you're not wanting quite, there are other things, so you're not wanting quite the powwow zap.
No. But yeah, it probably works again in the ground. Yeah, absolutely.
If you're doing a double layer, you'd probably do 100, but I think if you're doing a single layer, you'd probably do more like 60 to 70. Would be my estimate.
Yes. Yeah, I think good. So. Yeah, and a final thing on pots to keep all your pesky wildlife off. Use rose prunings, which is what we do here, to try and stop the wildlife digging up your bulbs. We found it quite successful here, haven't we? So we particularly use the rugosa roses because they're so prickly. If you've got them, cut stems as you need them in the autumn. It's fine. Doesn't matter when you prune your roses from sort of late autumn onwards. Cover your pots with rose prunings, and then very gingerly pick them off when the foliage comes through in spring.
Or use thorn-proof gloves.
Yes, absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you, Josie. So just to recap, 5 tulips, Orca, Slawa, Hermitage, Ice Stick, Silver Cloud, 4 Narcissus, Princess Amalia, Lemon Drops, Elka and Carice, 2 Iris reticulatas, Catherine Gold and Purple Hill, which of course flower in February, so they come first. So in your lasagne, they're the first top layer and they flower first. And then Dutch Iris, one we absolutely love is called Burning Embers, but there's another lovely one, Red Lion, and there are lots of nice whites. There's a variety called Alaska, but you'll find loads. More and more are being bred at the moment. And then finally, Gladiolus byzantinus. And I said there were 15, but actually I've counted them now, and there are in fact 13 in Josie's whole of spring bulb selection. I think they're great because they're not ones that probably I would have chosen, not because I don't love them, but because somehow I go for different sort of modes of selection, like perfume and things. But I absolutely love all of those, and I think they're really, really valuable to have in a list, and they will be in the podcast notes. Thank you, Josie.
Pleasure.
Thanks very much for listening to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange with me and Josie Lewis, our head gardener. Next week, I've got a week off, actually. I'm going on holiday, and Arthur is standing in for me, and he's interviewing a guy he's come across near him in Gloucestershire called Andy Monaghan, and he has created a cut flower patch from which he sells from scratch. And so they're going to be chatting about the things dear to their heart, which is growing, but really, really starting from scratch. So you won't see me then, but you'll see Arthur and Andy. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.